The morning of April 6th dawned clear, and both explorers were at the bungalow by 10 o'clock. Mr. Ward had the key, and an entry and cursory survey were made. From the disordered condition of Dr. Allen's room, it was obvious that the detectives had been there before, and the latter searchers hoped that they had found some clue which might prove of value. Of course, the main business lay in the cellar, so thither they descended without much delay, again making the circuit which each had vainly made before in the presence of the mad young owner. For a time, everything seemed baffling, each inch of the earthen floor and stone walls having so solid and innocuous an aspect that the thought of a yawning aperture was scarcely to be entertained. Willett reflected that since the original cellar was dug without knowledge of any catacombs beneath, the beginning of the passage would represent the strict modern delving of young Ward and his associates, where they had probed for the ancient vaults whose rumor could have reached them by no wholesome means. The doctor tried to put himself in Charles's place to see how a delver would be likely to start, but could not gain much inspiration from this method. Then he decided on elimination as a policy, and went carefully over the whole subterranean surface, both vertical and horizontal, trying to account for every inch separately. He was soon substantially narrowed down, and at last had nothing left but the small platform before the washtubs, which he had tried once before in vain. Now experimenting in every way possible and exerting a double strength, he finally found that the top did indeed turn and slide horizontally on a corner pivot. Beneath it lay a trim concrete surface with an iron mandible, to which Mr. Ward once rushed with excited zeal. The cover was not hard to lift, and the father had quite removed it when Willett noticed the queerness of his aspect. He was swaying and nodding dizzily, and in the gust of the noxious air which swept up from the black pit beneath, the doctor soon recognized ample cause. In a moment, Dr. Willett had his fainting companion on the floor above, and was reviving him with cold water. Mr. Ward responded feebly, but could be seen that the mephic blast from the crypt had in some way gravely sickened him. Wishing to take no chances, Willett hastened out to Broad Street for a taxicab and soon dispatched the sufferer home, despite his weak-voiced protest, after which he produced an electric torch, covered his nostrils with a band of sterile gauze, and descended once more to the pier into the new-found depths. The foul air had slightly abated, and Willett was able to send a beam of light down the Stygian hole. For about 10 feet he saw. It was a sheer cylindrical drop, with concrete walls and an iron ladder, after which the hole appeared to strike a flight of old stone steps which must have originally emerged to earth somewhat southward of the present building. Willett freely admits that for a moment the memory of the old Kerwin legends kept him from climbing down alone into that malodorous gulf. He could not help thinking of what Luke Fenner had reported on that last monstrous night. Then duty asserted itself, and he made the plunge, carrying a great valise for the removal of whatever papers might prove of supreme importance. Slowly, as he befitted one of his years, he descended the ladder and reached the slimy steps below. This was ancient masonry, his torch told him, and upon the dripping walls he saw the unwholesome moss of centuries. Down, down ran the steps, not spirally, but in 3 abrupt turns, and with such narrowness that 2 men could hardly have passed, only with difficulty. He had counted about 30 when a sound reached him very faintly, and after he did not feel disposed to count any more. It was a godless sound, one of those low-keyed, insidious outrages of nature which are not meant to be. To call it a dull wail, a doom-dragged whine, or a hopeless howl of coursed anguish and stricken flesh without mind would be to miss its most quintessential loathsomeness. and soul-sickening overtones. Was it for this that Ward seemed to listen? On that day he was removed, it was the most shocking thing that Willette had ever heard. And it continued from no determinate point, as the doctor reached the bottom of the steps and cast his torchlight around, on lofty corridor walls, surmounted by cyclopean vaulting, and pierced by numerous black archways. The hall in which he stood was perhaps 14 feet high to the middle of the vaulting and 10 or 12 feet broad. Its pavement was of large chipped flagstones, and its walls and roofs were of dressed masonry. Its length he could not imagine, for it stretched ahead indefinitely into the blackness. Of the archways, some had doors of the old six-paneled colonial type, whilst others had none. Overcoming the dread induced by the smell and howling, Willette began to explore those archways one by one, finding beyond them rooms with groined stone ceilings, each of the medium size and apparently of bizarre uses. Most of them had fireplaces, the upper courses of whose chimneys would have formed an interesting study in engineering. Never before or since had he seen such instruments or suggestions of instruments, which here loomed up on every hand through the bearing dust and cobwebs of a century and a half, in many cases evidently shattered as if by the ancient raiders, for many of the chambers seemed wholly untrodden by modern feet, and must have represented the earliest and most obsolete phases of Joseph Curwen's experimentations. Finally, there came a room of obvious modernity, or at least of recent occupancy. There were oil meters, bookshelves and tables, chairs and cabinets, and a desk piled high with papers of varying antiquity and contemporaneousness. Candlesticks and oil lamps stood about in several places, and finding a box of matches handy, Willette lighted such as were ready for use. In the fuller gleam it appeared that this apartment was nothing less than the latest study or library of Charles Ward. Of the books the doctor had seen before, and a good part of the furniture had plainly come from Prospect Street Mansion. Here and there was a piece well known to Willette, and the sense of familiarity became so great that he half forgot the noisomeness and the wailing, both of which were plainer than they had been. At the foot of the steps, his first duty, as planned long ahead, was to find and seize any papers which might seem of vital importance, especially those portentous documents found by Charles so long ago behind the picture in Olney Court. As he searched, he perceived how stupendous a task the final unraveling would be, for file on file was stuffed with papers in curious hands and bearing curious designs, so that months or even years might be needed for a thorough deciphering and editing. Once he found large packets of letters with Prague and Rackus postmarks, and in writing clearly recognizable as Orne's and Hutchinson's, all of which he took with him as part of the bundle to be removed in his valise. At last, in a locked mahogany cabinet, once gracing the Ward home, Willette found the batch of old Curwen papers, recognizing them from the reluctant glimpse Charles had granted him so many years ago. The youth had evidently kept them together very much as they had been when first he found them, since all the titles recalled by the workmen were present except the papers addressed to Orne and Hutchinson, and the cipher with its key. Willette placed the entire lot in his valise and continued his examination of the files. Since young Ward's immediate condition was the greatest matter at stake, the closest searching was done among the most obviously recent matter. And in this abundance of contemporary manuscript, one very baffling oddity was noted. That oddity was the slight amount in Charles's normal writing, and which indeed included nothing more recent than 2 months before. On the other hand, there were literally reams of symbols and formulae, historical notes, and philosophical comment, and a crabbed penmanship absolutely identical with the ancient script of Joseph Curwen, though of undeniably modern dating. Plainly a part of the latter-day program had been a sedulous imitation of the old wizard's writing, which Charles seemed to have carried to a marvelous state of perfection. Of any third hand, which might have been Allen's, there was not a trace. If he had indeed come to be the leader, he must have forced young Ward to act as his amanuensis, amanuensis. Well, how are we supposed to say it? In this new material, one mystical formula, or rather a pair of formulae, reoccurred so often that Willett had it by heart before he had half finished his quest. It consisted of two parallel columns. On the left one hand surmounted the archaic symbol called Dragon's Head, the north lunar node, and used an almanac to indicate the ascending node. And the right hand one, headed by a corresponding sign of Dragon's Tail, our descending node, the south lunar node. The appearance of the whole was something like this, and almost unconsciously the doctor realized that the second half was no more than the first, written syllabically backward, with the exception of North Node, Yai Nung Nunga Yog So Thoth E Geb I Throdog and for the south node, Og Throd Geb E Yog Sothoth Nugah Nug Ya Sro. The final monosyllables, and of the odd name Yog Sothoth, which he had come to recognize under various spellings from other things he had seen in connection with this horrible matter. The formula were as follows, exactly so as Willett is abundantly able to testify, and the first one struck an odd note of uncomfortable, latent memory in his brain, which he recognized later when reviewing the events of that horrible Good Friday of the previous year. So haunting were these formulae, and so frequently did he come upon them, that before the doctor knew it, he was repeating them under his breath. Eventually, however, he felt that he secured all the papers he could digest to advantage for the present, hence resolved to examine no more, till he could bring the skeptical alienist and Massa for a simple and more systematic raid. He had still to find the hidden laboratory. So leaving his valise in a lighted room, he emerged again into the black, noisome corridor, whose vaulting echoed ceaselessly with dull and hideous whine. The next few rooms he tried were all abandoned or filled only with crumbling boxes and ominous-looking leaden coffins, but impressed him deeply with the magnitude of Joseph Curwen's original operations. He thought of the slaves and seamen who had disappeared, of the graves which had been violated in every part of the world, and of what the final raiding party must have seen. And then he decided it was better not to think any more. Once a great stone staircase mounted at his right, and he deduced that this must have reached to one of the Curwen outbuildings. Perhaps the famous stone edifice, the high slit-like windows, provided the steps he had descended, had led from the steep-roofed farmhouse. Suddenly the walls seemed to fall away ahead, and the stench and the wailing grew stronger. Willett saw that he had come upon a vast, open space, so great that his torchlight would not carry across it, and he had advanced. As he advanced, he encountered occasional stout pillars supporting the arches of the roof. After a time, he reached a circle of pillars, grouped like monoliths of Stonehenge, with a large carved altar on a base of 3 steps in the center. And so curious were the carvings on that altar that he approached to study them with his electric light. But when he saw what they were, he shrank away, shuddering, and did not stop to investigate the dark stains which discolored the upper surface and had spread down the sides in occasional thin lines. Instead, he found the distant wall and traced it as it swept round in a gigantic circle, perforated by occasional black doorways, and indented by a myriad of shallow cells, with iron gratings and wrist and ankle bonds on chains fastened to the stone of the concave rear masonry. These cells were empty, but still the horrible odor and the dismal moaning continued, more instant now than ever, and seemingly varied at times by a sort of slippery thumping. Part 2. From that frightful smell and that uncanny noise, Willette's attention could no longer be diverted. Both were plainer and more hideous in the great pillared hall than anywhere else, and carried a vague impression of being far below, even in this dark netherworld of subterranean mystery. Before trying any of the black archways for steps leading further down, the doctor cast his beam of light about the stone-flagged floor. It was very loosely paved, and at irregular intervals there would occur a slab curiously pierced by small holes, in no definite arrangement, while at one point there lay a very long ladder carelessly flung down. To this ladder, singularly enough, appeared to cling a particularly large amount of the frightful odor which encompassed everything. As he walked slowly about it, suddenly occurred to Willette that both the noise and the odor seemed strongest directly above the oddly pierced slabs, as if they might be crude trapdoors leading down still deeper to some region of horror. Kneeling by one, he worked at it with his hands, and found that with extreme difficulty he could budge it. At his touch, the moaning beneath ascended to a louder key, and only with vast trepidation did he persevere in the lifting of the heavy stone. A stench, unnameable now, rose from below, and the doctor's head reeled dizzily as he laid back the slab, and turned his torch upon the exposed square of gaping blackness. If he had expected a flight of steps to some wide gulf of ultimate abomination, Willette was destined to be disappointed, for amidst that foetor and cracked whining, he discerned only the brick-faced top of a cylindrical well, perhaps 1.5 yards in diameter, and devoid of any ladder or other means of descent. As the light shone down, the wailing changed suddenly to a series of horrible yelps, in connection with which there came again that sound of blind, futile scrambling and slippery thumping. The explorer trembled, unwilling to even imagine what noxious thing might be lurking in that abyss. But in a moment he mustered up the courage to peer over the rough-hewn brink, lying at full length and holding the torch downward at arm's length to see what might lie below. For a second he could distinguish nothing but the slimy, moss-grown brick walls, slinking illimitably into that half-tangible miasma of murk and foulness and anguished frenzy. Then he saw that something dark was leaping clumsily and frantically up and down at the bottom of the narrow shaft, which must have been from 20 to 25 feet below the stone floor where he lay. The torch shook in his hand, but he looked again to see what manner of living creature might be immersed there in the darkness of that unnatural well, left starving by young Ward through all the long month since the doctors had taken him away, and clearly one of a vast number prisoned in the kindred wells, whose pierced stone covers so thickly studded the floor of the great vaulted cavern. Whatever the things were, they could not lie down in their cramped spaces, but they must have crouched and whined and waited feebly, and leaped all those hideous weeks since their master had abandoned them unheeded. But Marinus Bicknell Willette was sorry that he had looked again, for surgeon and veteran of the dissecting room though he was, he has not been the same since. It is hard to explain just how a single sight of a tangible object with measurable dimensions could so shake and change a man, and we may only say that there is about certain outlines and entities a power of symbolism and suggestion which acts frightfully on a sensitive thinker's perspective and whispers terrible hints of obscure cosmic relationships and unnameable realities behind protective illusions of common vision. In that second look, Willette saw such an outline or entity, for during the next few instants he was undoubtedly as stark mad as any inmate of Dr. Waite's private hospital. He dropped the electric torch from a hand drained of muscular power or nervous coordination, nor heeded the sound of crunched teeth which told of its fate at the bottom of the pit. He screamed and screamed and screamed in a voice whose falsetto panic no acquaintance of his world would ever have recognized, and though he could not rise to his feet, he crawled and rolled desperately away over the damp pavement where dozens of Tartarian wells poured forth their exhausted whining and yelping to answer his own insane cries. He tore his hands on the rough loose stones and many times bruised his head against the frequent pillars, But still he kept on. Then at last he slowly came to himself in the utter blackness and stench, and stopped his ears against the droning wall into which the burst of yelping had subsided. He was drenched with perspiration and without means of producing a light. Stricken and unnerved in this abysmal blackness and horror, and crushed with a memory he could not efface, beneath him dozens of those things still lived, and from one of the shafts the cover was removed. He knew that what he had seen could never climb up the slippery walls, yet shuddered at the thought that some obscure foothold might exist. What the thing was, he would never tell. It was like some of the carvings on the hellish altar, but it was alive. Nature had never made it in this form. It was too palpably unfinished. The deficiencies were of the most surprising sort, and the abnormalities of proportion could not be described. Willett consents only to say that this type of thing must have represented entities which Ward called up from imperfect salts, and which he kept for servile or ritualistic purposes. If it had not had a certain significance, its image would not have been carved on that damnable stone. It was not the worst thing depicted on that stone, but Willett never opened the other pits. At the time, the first connected idea in his mind was an idle paragraph from some of the old Curwen data he had digested long before, a phrase used by Simon or Jedediah Orne in that pretentious confiscated letter to the bygone sorcerer. Certainly, there was nothing but Elivist awfulness in that which H raised up from what he could gather only a part of. Then, horribly supplementing rather than displacing this image, there came a recollection of these ancient lingering rumors. Anent the burned and twisted thing found in the fields a week after the Curwen raid. Charles Ward had once told the doctor what old Slocum said of that object. It was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Pawtuxet folk had ever seen or read about. These words hummed in the doctor's mind as he rocked to and fro, squatting on the nitrous stone floor. He tried to drive them out and repeated the Lord's Prayer to himself, eventually trailing off into a mnemonic hodgepodge, like the modernist wasteland of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and finally reverting to the oft-repeated dual formula he had lately found in Ward's underground library. Nagah, Yog Sothoth, and so on, until the final underlined throw. It seemed to soothe him, and he staggered to his feet after a time, lamenting bitterly his fright-lost torch and looking wildly for any gleam of light in the clutching inkiness of the chilly air. Think he would not, but he strained his eyes in every direction for some faint glint or reflection of the bright illumination he had left in the library. After a while he thought he detected a suspicion of a glow infinitely far away, and towards this he crawled in agonized caution on hands and knees amidst the stench and howling, always feeling ahead lest he collide with the numerous great pillars or stumble into the abominable pit he had just uncovered. Once, his shaking fingers touched something which he knew must be the steps leading to the hellish altar, and from this spot he recoiled in loathing. At another time he encountered the pierced slab he had removed, and here the caution became almost pitiful. He did not come upon the dread aperture to detain him. But he did not come upon that aperture. What had been down there made no sound nor stir. Evidently its crunching of the falling electric torch had not been good for it. Each time Willett's fingers felt a perforated slab, he trembled. His passage over it would sometimes increase the groaning below, but generally it had produced no effect at all, since he moved very noiselessly. Several times during his progress, the glow ahead diminished perceptibly, and he realized that the various candles and lamps he had left must be expiring one by one. The thought of being lost in utter darkness without matches, amidst this underground world of nightmarish labyrinths, impelled him to rise to his feet and run, which he could safely do now that he had passed the open pit. For he knew that once the light failed, his only hope of rescue and survival would lie in whatever relief party Mr. Ward might send after missing him for a sufficient period. Presently, however, he emerged from the open space into the narrow corridor, and definitely located the glow was coming from a door on his right. In a moment, he had reached it, and was standing once more in young Ward's secret library, trembling with relief and watching the sputterings of that last lamp, which had brought him to safety. And part 3 starts here. In another moment, he was hastily lifting the burned-out lamps from an oil supply which he previously noticed, and when the room was bright again, he looked about to see if he might find a lantern for further exploration. For racked though he was with horror, his sense of grim purpose was still uppermost, and he was firmly determined to leave no stone unturned in his search for the hideous facts behind Charles Ward's bizarre madness. Failing to find a lantern, he chose the smallest of lamps to carry, also filling his pockets with candles and matches, and taking with him a gallon of oil, which he proposed to keep for reserve use, and whatever hidden laboratory he might uncover beyond the terrible open space with its unclean altar and the nameless covered wells. To traverse that space again would require his ultimate fortitude, but he knew it must be done. Fortunately, neither the frightful altar nor the open shaft was near the vast cell and dented wall, which bounded the cavern area, and whose black mysterious archways would form the next goals of a logical search. So Willett went back to that great pillared hall of stench and anguished howling, turned down his lamps to avoid any distant glimpse of the hellish altar, or that uncovered pit with the pierced stone slab beside it. Most of the doorways led merely to small chambers, some vacant and some evidently used as storerooms, and several of the latter he saw some very curious accumulations of various objects. One was packed with rotting and dust-draped bales of spare clothing, and the explorer thrilled when he saw that it was unmistakably the clothing of a century and a half before. In another room he found numerous odds and ends of modern clothing, as if gradual provisions were being made to equip a large body of men. But what he disliked most of all were the huge copper vats, which occasionally appeared. These, and the sinister incrustations upon them, he liked them even less than the weirdly figured leaden bowls, whose ruins retained such obnoxious deposits and around which clung repellent odors, perceptibly above even the general noisomeness of the crypt. When he had completed about half the entire circuit of the wall, he found another corridor like that from which he had come, and out of which many doors opened. This he proceeded to investigate, and after entering 3 rooms of medium size and of no significant contents, he came at last to a large oblong apartment whose business-like tanks and tables and furnaces and modern instruments, occasional books, and endless shelves of jars and bottles proclaimed it, indeed, the long-sought laboratory of Charles Ward, and no doubt of old Joseph Curwen before him. After lighting the 3 lamps, which he found filled and ready, Dr. Willett examined the place and all its appurtenances with the keenest interest, noting from the relative quantities of various reagents on the shelves that young Ward's dominant concern must have been with some branch of organic chemistry. On the whole, little could be learned from the scientific ensemble, which included a gruesome-looking dissecting table, so that the room was really rather a disappointment. Among the books was a tattered old copy of Borellus in black letters, and it was weirdly interesting to note that Ward had underlined the same passage whose marking had so perturbed good Mr. Merritt at Curwen's farmhouse more than a century and a half before. That older copy, of course, must have perished along with the rest of Curwen's occult library in the final raid. 3 archways opened off the laboratory, and these the doctor proceeded to sample in turn. From his cursory survey, he saw that the 2 led merely to small storerooms, but these he he canvassed with care, remarking the piles of coffins in various stages of damage, and shuddering violently at 2 or 3 of the few coffin places he could decipher. There was much clothing also stored in these rooms, and several new and tightly nailed boxes which he did not stop to investigate. Most interesting of all, perhaps, were some odd bits which he judged to be fragments of old Joseph Curwen's laboratory appliances. These had suffered damage at the hands of the raiders, but were still partially recognizable as the chemical paraphernalia of the Georgian period. The third archway led to a sizable chamber, entirely lined with shelves and having in the center a table bearing 2 lamps. These lamps were lit lighted, and in their brilliant glow studied the endless shelving which surrounded him. Some of the upper levels were wholly vacant, but most of the space was filled with small, odd-looking leaden jars of 2 general types. One tall and without handles, like a Grecan lykithos or oil jar, and the other with a single handle proportioned like a phaleron jug. All had metal stoppers and were covered with peculiar-looking symbols molded in low relief. In a moment, the doctor noticed that these jugs were classified with a great rigidity. All the lykithoi being on one side of the room, with the large wooden side reading custodes above them, and all the phalerons on the other correspondingly labeled with a sign reading materia. Each of the jars or jugs, except some on the upper shelves, turned out to be vacant, for a cardboard tag with a number apparently referring to a catalog, and Willett resolved to look for the latter presently. For the moment, however, he is more interested in the nature of the array as a whole, and experimentally opened several of the lykithoi and phalerons at random with a view to a rough generalization. The result was invariable. Both types of jar contained a small quantity of a single kind of substance, a fine dusty powder of very light weight and of many shades of dull neutral color. To the colors which formed the only point of variation, there was no apparent method of disposal, and no distinction between what occurred in the lykithoi and what occurred in the phalerons. A bluish-gray powder might be side by side of a pinkish-white one, and any one in a phaleron might have its exact powder counterpart in a lykithos. The most individual feature about the powders was their non-adhesiveness. Willett would pour one into his hand, and upon returning it to its jug would find that no residue whatever remained on his palm. The meaning of the 2 signs puzzled him, and he wondered why this battery of chemicals was separated so radically from those in the glass jars on the shelves of the laboratory proper. And don't do that with unidentified chemicals. You can poison yourself something sound.